61岁的阿黛尔·特纳勋爵是一位成功的金融家和著名的经济学家。2008年，他临危受命，出任英国金融服务局主席。英国金融服务局呢是全世界最权威、最严格的金融监管机构之一，其职责呢是对包括银行、保险、证券和期货在内的金融服务行业进行监管，以保证金融市场的高效、有序、廉洁和公平。在担任金融服务局主席期间，特纳对全球金融监管改革做出了重要贡献。最近几年来，他活跃于各种学术论坛，对当代金融的一系列重大问题阐述自己独到的见解。在2015年完成的重要著作《债务和魔鬼》一书中，他对造成2008年金融危机的原因进行了深入的系统分析，并就如何克服危机后遗症、恢复全球经济增长提出了有益于主流观点，但是却令人信服的政策建议，得到了国际学术界的普遍好评。不久前，特纳来到北京，为《债务和魔鬼》中文版进行推广宣传，并接受了财新时间的专访。
So very nice to talk to you again, Lord Turner. So the title of your book is The Debt and the Devil. It seems the devil is not necessarily bad, isn't it?
That's right. The devil to which I refer in my book title is from a famous part in German literature, from Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust Part 2, where the devil tempts the emperor and says to him, if you want money, emperor, you can print it. Now, in Faust Part 2, the emperor ends up printing too much, and Jens Weidmann, who is the president of the Bundesbank, gave a speech in 2012 warning Mario Draghi not to become a devil and not to print too much money through quantitative easing. But the point I make is that when we are stuck in a deep debt overhang, deflationary trap, which is where I think the world is stuck at the moment, printing money and spending it can sometimes be the least risky way out of that trap. Now, it would have been much better if in the first place we'd never created too much debt. And at the core of my book is an argument that, of course, there are dangers of governments running too large debts and creating money, and there are, as it were, devilish dangers there. But there are also big dangers in the private financial system creating too much debt, as it did in the advanced economies before the crisis. So the idea of between debt and the devil is we are caught between alternative problems, that states and political processes can give us problems, but so too can free financial markets.
It's a choice of danger.
It's a choice of dangers. There's a choice of dangers. There's no perfect way through.
So how to actually guard against the political kind of intervention in this process?
I think that we can locate the decision on how much of it is allowed within an independent targeting central bank. So in the Eurozone, I would not want individual governments to start saying we're going to tell the ECB how much it should print and give to us to spend. But I think the ECB ought to have the option of saying we've been trying to get the inflation rate back up to 2%. The tools that we're using are not working. So we now recommend that a helicopter money drop, a distribution of money, whatever you call it, to the citizens of Europe would be the most effective way to get the inflation rate up. I think we can locate the decision within independent, trusted, inflation-targeting central banks.
And essentially, money finance is kind of permanent QE. And you mentioned in the US, it actually practiced it in the 1940s.
If you look at how did America pay for the Second World War, they increased taxes, they issued some government debt which citizens really owned and were really paid back, and they issued some government debt which the Federal Reserve bought and kept on its balance sheets forever, and the Federal Reserve balance sheet never reduced. And therefore, some of the Second World War was essentially paid for by money finance. Now, it produced a higher rate of inflation than we now want, but it did not produce hyperinflation, and when it came to a stop, it was able to slow the inflation rate back down. And it enabled actually not only America to win the war, but an enormous expansion of the American economy. So there have been successful examples in history of monetary finance which have stimulated the economies, but which have not produced hyperinflation. The impact crucially depends on how much you do. It is as simple as that.
当前世界的经济仍然处于国际金融危机后的深度调整期，各主要经济体的经济走势也进一步的分化。美国的经济温和复苏，英国脱欧公投引发欧元区市场的波动，而日本的经济持续低迷，部分新兴经济体的实体经济面临着很多困难。而如何通过货币和财政政策间的协调、优化和配合，以便达到经济增速的目标，成为了各国当下面临的重要课题。
We recently talked to Ben Bernanke. He is suggesting China and Germany are the two major economies which still have fiscal space. But I think people think this is quite standard thinking. But it just seems Germany and China don't want to do too much fiscal stimulus. How will people be able to persuade them?
Well, the standard orthodoxy of the world at the moment, as expressed by the IMF and by the OECD and many other people, is that we've reached the limit of what pure monetary policy through the interest rate or temporary QE can do, and that we need some element of fiscal stimulus. But you're absolutely right. The trouble is the people who have the fiscal space don't want to use it. It's all very well saying to the Germans, you have fiscal space, increase your debt finance fiscal deficits, that they don't want to do it. And it was pretty clear at the meeting of finance ministers and G20 finance ministers and central bank governors in Shanghai that there was encouragement to China to increase its debt finance fiscal deficit. But the latest statement of the plan for the fiscal deficit this year at 3% is no higher than last year. Because countries still do feel, even if the IMF says you've got fiscal space, they feel that they are constrained by a problem of a debt sustainability. So I think we do have to think about how we get round this problem of debt sustainability. Now, I don't believe that all countries in the world should do monetary finance. I'm certainly worried that we could overdo monetary finance. But what I've tried to do in my book and my other writing is what I call taking monetary finance out of the taboo box, not treating it as something which is totally forbidden and we're not even allowed to talk about, but having an open discussion of the fact that under some circumstances it is technically possible to deploy it in a moderate amount which will have a moderate stimulus to nominal demand. I think that's absolutely clear, and I think we ought to be honest enough and grown up enough to have that debate around the world.
So basically Japan and Europe doing money finance, China and Germany doing fiscal stimulus, and US hold off raising the rates.
Well, that would be a combination of things. I think Japan clearly needs to do helicopter money finance stimulus. I think it should have done it years ago, as indeed Ben Bernanke told them to do in 2003. I mean, Ben Bernanke is very interested in this. Ben is now very wary of talking about money finance, but in a speech in Japan in 2003, he very clearly told the Japanese authorities that they ought to think about money finance. I think it should definitely be done in Japan, and I think actually it will be done in Japan. I think in the Eurozone, it should ideally be done, but my fear is that the political difficulties of doing it in the Eurozone are too great, and that we will be stuck for many years with deflation and low growth. In China, yes, I think at the moment I would just go for classic debt-financed fiscal stimulus. And in the US economy is growing. I think there will be a very cautious rate of increase of interest rates. I would not expect more than either one or two more increases this year. And I think they will end up with an interest rate even after 2 or 3 years, which is well below the historical average. But I don't think the US needs to do radically different policies than it's doing at the moment, whereas Japan and the Eurozone do.
2008年全球金融危机过后呢，各国都在重新评估以往基于微观审慎的金融监管体系，提出并且推行了各种各样的改革方案。美国扩大美联储的监管权限，整合银行的监管权，而欧盟呢，则着手建立统一的财政体系和金融监管体系。中国也在“十三五”规划纲要当中明确的要求，要进一步的改革金融监管体系，加强宏观审慎管理，对重要性的金融机构统筹监管，建立功能监管和行为监管的框架。特纳表示，金融危机之后，英国调整金融机构的监管职能，加强了对宏观经济把控的做法，这些都是值得参考的。他建议中国应该在金融体系内建立一个权威机构，总体协调各部门的职能。
You talk about your 4.5-year experience at FSB, and also you came to FSA right at the center of financial crisis. So China is undergoing its kind of latest round of regulatory reshuffle. What would be your suggestions for China this time?
Well, when I took over at the FSA in September 2008, I became part of a structure that we then had, where it had a complete separation between the Bank of England, which was a very pure monetary authority, essentially focusing on achieving a low and stable rate of inflation by moving the interest rate. And the FSA covered the whole of the financial sector, but it did tend to focus its regulation and its supervision on a very micro basis, institution by institution, and quite a legalistic basis, saying these are the rules, we apply them. And between those two, we lost sight of the overall macroprudential picture of how much credit there was in total, how much leverage was developing, where that leverage was developing, whether there was too much leverage in the real estate sector in particular. Now, what we created subsequently was a structure whereby prudential regulation went back to the Bank of England, and I think that has worked well, but I don't think it was absolutely necessary, because the most important bit of the new reforms is a creation of a thing called the Financial Policy Committee, located in the Bank of England, chaired by the Governor of the Bank of England, with a supporting secretariat which looks at the totality of the macro picture, the development of leverage, the development of asset prices, the development of lending against real estate, and which is able to pull macro-prudential tools like loan-to-value limits, capital requirements against real estate lending. So I wouldn't want to advise China to do any particular arrangement. I think you can arrange the organizational boxes in different ways, but whatever the arrangement of responsibilities, I think you need to locate somewhere in the system a committee, an authority, which looks at the totality of the credit creation process and which decides in an integrated fashion about which macroprudential levers to pull. That's the most important principle to make sure you've got that somewhere in the system.
You talked a lot about financial liberalization and financial deepening over there. China's capital account liberalization efforts have been pretty much driven by this kind of mindset, which see from now is a little bit risky. What's your message to Governor Zhou?
I think capital account liberalization, there will be a natural tendency of a move towards that, but there's no reason why you have to do that quickly. You can do it at a measured, steady pace, and you should keep the ability to control particular bits of hot money flow. As for financial liberalization in general, I mean, I think some of the key aspects of financial liberalization, like liberalizing the deposit rate, I think that is required, because if you don't liberalize the deposit rate, you create all sorts of arbitrages through the wealth management products, through the trust-based loans, etc. You create a shadow banking system. What I think all countries should be very wary of, however, is the pre-crisis belief that financial deepening was always good. If you look at the pre-crisis literature, there was an assumption that more debt to GDP was a good thing, or that more market capitalization relative to GDP was a good thing, or that a bigger financial sector as a percent of GDP was a good thing. And I think we learned in 2008 that that is not necessarily true. There are particular aspects of financial deepening which are valuable, but it is also possible, as the OECD argued in a very important paper last June, it's possible to have too much finance as well as too little. And I think there is now a much more intelligent debate about this across the world.
You touch a lot about on the real estate sector in your book. So for China, how can China actually managing while developing this sector?
Well, one of the interesting things about the development of the Chinese economy is that you have become much more real estate focused at a far earlier stage of economic development and at the growth of GDP per capita. Now, that has had many benefits, but it is also clearly creating major risks. There are major risks that outside the the big coastal cities and the tier 1 and tier 2 cities, in the tier 3 cities, there is a real danger that there is very significant wasted investment going on with apartment blocks which will be surplus to requirement and will never be occupied. And then in the tier 1 cities, there is a different risk, which is we are now seeing in Shanghai and in Shenzhen and in Beijing exactly those cycles of more credit and more real estate prices of existing real estate, which we have seen in London, in Dublin, in Manhattan, and in other advanced economies. So China is a very interesting situation. It has both aspects of a classic advanced economy credit and real estate boom, and it also has this huge urban infrastructure investment challenge. And it has to think very carefully about how it manages the overcreation of debt in that process, and how it also makes sure that it is not pouring too much concrete and concrete in the wrong parts of China.
2016年20国集团领导人峰会 G20 将于9月份在杭州举行，推动国际金融治理改革是此次峰会的重点议题之一。2016年年底呢，中国在接任 G20 主席国后宣布重启2012年后停滞的国际金融架构工作组，并召开工作组的首次会议，讨论议题包括了资本流动、主权债务重组和债务可持续性、全球的金融安全网、基金组织份额和治理改革以及扩大 SDR 的使用等等。在专访中呢，特纳也重点谈及了对其中一些议题的看法。
So for this year's G20, China actually kind of relaunched this International Financial Architecture Working Group. So what agenda do you think China, FSB or IMF should push for? There are choices like better kind of capital flow monitoring, enhance the role of SDR in the international monetary system. Which ones do you prefer?
Well, I think if you move on from the theoretical issues of debt and the problems of domestic debt management and look at the international financial and monetary system, it is a very, very complicated issue. I think there are some things we know. We know that we were wrong before 2007 and even more before 1997, we were wrong to believe that the complete and rapid and immediate liberalization of capital flows was just perfect and there would be no problems. We know from a lot of good work that short-term capital flows, and in particular short-term capital flows intermediated by branches, can cause a lot of volatility and problems. We do not believe that we will be able to have total capital flow constraints, because we can't do that in a world of global trade, but nor do we say that there should be no constraints at all. Instead, we try to be sensible about constraints which operate in particular on the hottest forms of inflow and outflow. For instance, I think countries can place constraints on rapid hot money flows coming through the banking system. They can use things like reserve requirements and taxation policies to just slow that down a bit. So I think that debate, the debate about really trying to get to a rich understanding of what capital forms of capital constraint can be useful in a world of global trade flows, I think that is undoubtedly on the agenda. The SDR, I have to say, I think is in many ways more of a symbolic issue than a real issue. I don't think we're going to make rapid progress to a major role for the SDR as a reserve currency. I think what we're going to see is a gradual evolution of the internationalization of the RMB. I think we will see a gradual evolution of the use of more than one reserve currency in the world. But I think it's very difficult to mandate that at a global level. Reserve currencies are sort of chosen by the free market players within the system, and they choose the reserve currencies which have the maximum amount of liquidity and are easiest to use. So I think we're going to see a natural evolution there.